Good afternoon. I'd like to share a talk about patterns and explanatory gaps in psychotherapy, which is inspired by a wonderful symposium Michael Levin started about the Platonic forms. And there's a subscript here, Does God Play Dice, which is the theme I couldn't help but mention, in addition to patterns and explanatory gaps in psychotherapy. And the two themes throughout the presentation will intertwine, and I hope that it will be worth your while. I'd like to start here at this New York Times article describing the work by Michael Levin, Doug Blackiston, and Josh Bongard, and their colleagues in the lab who created Xenobots. And the article in New York Times was called "Meet the Xenobots: Virtual Creatures Brought to Life." And I don't know about you, but I had the awe-inspiring moment, goosebumps, if you wish, because this discovery in science is one of these moments when we feel something very special happened, and this language brought to life suggests that a new organism was created, a new life, and it has qualities such as kinematic self-replication. So it felt special to me, and I just wanted to highlight that feeling that I felt, and I don't know about everyone else, when I became familiar with this work. And in Michael, your talk at the symposium, you ask this question: where did this come from? And you refer to a specific pattern, whether it's a biological pattern, such as a morphogenic pattern, or a behavioral pattern of certain kind of behaviors. An example would be Xenobot's ability for kinematic self-replication. You pose a question and saying, where did that come from? It is clearly not in the evolution. It is not historical. It is not in the physics. Where did it come from? And before diving in, I wanted to explore this question and kind of what's going on here. To me, this question constitutes an explanatory gap. We observe something very special, and we don't have an explanation just yet. And I'd like to start by discussing explanatory gaps more broadly. They may sometimes feel unpleasant. This is not the only possible circumstance, but they suggest that we don't have a working model for what we observe, which could potentially be dangerous and perceived as an uncertain threat associated with a feeling of anxiety. We feel that we don't have control here, and we cannot decrease the unpredictability right now. There is a gap in understanding. In terms of free energy principle, perhaps we can say that explanatory gaps suggest that there's a higher probability of surprise and prediction errors that would be consequential for the system. And in these circumstances, we can't possibly select an action plan that would take care of issues because we don't have a model of what's going on. We have an explanatory gap. Sometimes explanatory gaps can feel miraculous, and the specific emotion that we can talk about is called awe, the proverbial goosebumps. And, you have this lovely photograph of a child, and this may be a feeling of surprise, which is close, but, I'd like to talk about awe specifically. And there's a photo credit that Storytelling Mom website where this image came from. By the way, the etymology of the word awful is from the word awe, a very special feeling that we have as humans. Now, once we have the explanatory gap, whatever we feel about it, usually we're motivated to fill this gap with something. And we'd like to reduce the uncertainty, possibly anxiety, and that would allow us to conserve energy that is required metabolically to tolerate uncertainty. An additional nuance here that is slightly different but possibly related is what's called a Zeigarnik effect. Bluma Zeigarnik was studying in Germany with Kurt Lewin, one of the founders of Gestalt psychology in Germany. He is the author of the famous phrase that one of the most practical things is a good theory. I'm paraphrasing, but the content is similar. And what she found out observationally while being in restaurants is that a waiter in Germany would remember very sophisticated order while it was unfulfilled. And the moment the food is brought to the table, he would forget about the order. And this has to do with the sensation that something is unfinished. And we have an itch or an impulse to close the gestalt, so to speak. We have an itch to take care of that problem. And particularly when we have multiple unclosed gestalts, we don't feel so good, and we are inclined to find an explanation and to close the problem. So how do we fill in the gap in an explanation? Sometimes we're inclined to look for an answer, and that would be called epistemic foraging in free energy principle framework, or Jaak Panksepp would call it seeking. This is exploratory activity. We may infer, which is inductive reasoning. And in science, a form of inference can be a formulation of a hypothesis that we would subsequently test. In our daily lives, we may be content with some explanation, some story that seems to fill in the gap, and we'll leave it at that. And there are extreme forms in psychopathology or in some neurological conditions, such as confabulations. An extreme example, perhaps, of that would be Korsakoff syndrome, where a person has a specific kind of amnesia, retrieval amnesia, and they do not have an ability to fluently retrieve data. It's there, but they cannot fluently retrieve it, identify the correct one, and at times they're confused between the real memory engram and fantasy and wishful thinking, and they substitute one for another. For example, a patient with the syndrome, when asked about what happened yesterday, would very confidently, very fluently, without a shred of doubt, tell you that they were hanging out with their buddy John and drinking beers and gossiping. And none of that happened because they were in the hospital. But they would kind of create this very quick story and they would confabulate. At a lower scale, all of us could confabulate at times. We fill in the gap with something. But I can give you a specific, more extreme clinical example of a neurological confabulation. In addition, when we have the sensation of something miraculous happening, perhaps the sensation of awe, we may be prone to a more mystical or religious explanation. Feeling of awe is quite special, and to gravitate toward a benign, kind of banal answer, such as statistics in these circumstances, doesn't seem sufficient to us. To quote Pushkin, he said, "You can't measure harmony with algebra." And perhaps Einstein's famous "God doesn't play dice" is a protest against the attempts to do so, to measure harmony with algebra. Now, there are some studies, this literature is not without controversy, but there's some studies suggesting that when we feel awe, we may be more prone to mystical explanations. Specifically, Valdesolo and colleagues reviewed 5 experiments in which the feeling of awe was induced. And they've, in all of these cases, observed that uncertainty tolerance was reduced when a person feels awe, and they would have an increase in supernatural beliefs, as well as intentional pattern perception. People were prone to attribute agency as an explanation. They were looking for a gential explanation, which correlates with seeking religious and mystical explanations. This effect may indeed be mediated by culture. A study by Vanka Pillen and colleagues studied this in individuals who are indeed religious. And again, the feeling of awe resulted in very similar outcomes. And I just want to give you a citation from this 3rd study by Shiota and colleagues, that awe has been defined as an emotional response to perceptually vast stimuli that overwhelm current mental structures, yet facilitate attempts at accommodation. So I think there's a typo here, attempts at communication. And the vastness can be experienced if you're standing in a Gothic cathedral and it's huge, or if you're at the base camp of Everest and you look at it and you are in awe from just the sheer size of that and the beauty. So how soon do we fill in the gap? This may depend on our state, physical and mental state, especially our resourcefulness. It may depend on our ability to tolerate uncertainty at the baseline, whether it's well developed or not. And there's developmental aspects here. Babies have very low uncertainty tolerance. And also, it may depend on how high the stakes are. Perhaps in circumstances of life and death, we would be more inclined to try to fill in the gap sooner. Uh, a specific kind of filling in the gap is something that Nassim Taleb referred to as narrative fallacy. Another perhaps way to explain it is our proclivity, which is a very human trait, and all of us are prone to it, to connect the dots prematurely when we don't have sufficient evidence, sufficient data that certain dots are connected. I'll give you an example by Lawrence Kiermaier about the story of depression in Japan. And this is an example of narrative fallacy used in advertising. And of course, it wasn't labeled as such. But in Japanese language, the word depression didn't exist. And GlaxoSmithKline decided to enter the market. And naturally, the sales of SSRIs were zero. And they started by organizing a conference on cultural aspects of mental health, and they invited famous, specialists and experts from all over the world, including Professor Kiermaier. And they've studied the cultural aspects of mental health. And then they launched an advertising campaign consisting of three messages. Message number one, depression is a common disease. Message number two, it is caused by chemical imbalance. And message number three, we have a solution for that called Paxil. And this is a prime example of narrative fallacy, specifically the second bullet point. Depression is caused by chemical imbalance is a story that doesn't hold water now. If you ask any neuroscientist worth their diploma, then you will not get a sufficient causal chain of events from a molecule of serotonin all the way to a macro phenomenon of depression that we feel phenomenologically in our minds. But this is just one example, and we have experiences of narrative fallacies throughout our lives quite often, and we may not notice them in journalism, in economics, in media. Perhaps an extreme example of that would be conspiracy fallacy. So no one is above this narrative fallacy. It's a human thing to do. And the two links you see here, I wrote a peer-reviewed paper about that as narrative fallacy being applied to what I do, psychodynamic psychotherapy, case formulation. But the text on Psychology Today, which you can easily Google by looking for narrative fallacy in clinical psychology and psychiatry, is a summary of that with very minimum jargon. And the YouTube presentation is a talk at McGill on this subject. So explanatory gaps in psychotherapy. I'm quoting here Mark Solms, and I think he mentioned it at the clinical workshop at the Neuropsychoanalysis Association. But in some circumstances, when the patient comes in and they have a referral question or a problem that they come with, we don't necessarily have an explanatory gap. Let's say we conduct a clinical interview and the patient complains about not being able to fall asleep, which we call sleep onset insomnia. And we find out through talking to them that sleep hygiene is a problem, that the bedroom is warm and not very dark, and it's noisy, that the patient eats before bedtime and stares at the screen. And perhaps this can be sufficient for us to provide information on sleep hygiene, and that may take care of the problem. So if you wish, this is information sharing, teaching, and that's that. An alternative scenario is when the patient comes in with an isolated phobia and that's all they want. Let's imagine that they cannot ride an elevator. They're afraid of elevators. And they don't want to talk about their, culture and upbringing and, history of employment. They just want to ride an elevator. And what may be done in these circumstances is what's called exposure and ritual prevention psychotherapy, a specific kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, where the clinician is holding the patient by the hand, who's kicking and screaming, maybe for a prolonged period of time, maybe an hour. And this is being repeated 5, 6, 10 times. And subsequently, the behavior subsides. The phobic memory isn't actually going anywhere, but the patient becomes able to ride an elevator due to development of a new memory in parallel, which suggests that elevators are reasonably stable. This can be seen as coaching, as sort of doing something together that takes care of the problem. But there are circumstances which are neither, where teaching or coaching would not be sufficient. You can't really coach or teach a person when the issue is unknown. Freud talked about that you can't fight an enemy in absentia. And in these circumstances, psychodynamic psychotherapy may be appropriate. I will perhaps give you some examples of the kind of gaps that we work with. When the patient would say, I feel badly and I don't exactly know what that is and how it came about, and I feel like that all the time. They're not well. I mean, they're suffering from mental pain, but it's unexplainable. Or they may tell you that they're doing something repeatedly and know that they shouldn't be doing it, but they keep on doing it and they're not sure why. So these are examples of explanatory gaps. And what we tend to think, as a preliminary, perhaps theory-driven hypothesis, is one of the possible answers here is that an unconscious process is at play. And by the word unconscious, we don't mean anything mystical. I mean, in contemporary psychodynamic therapy of Mark Solm's flavor, we will talk about the neuropsychology of what we mean by that. And it is indeed, mainstream neurobiology when, we talk about unconscious processes. Most of what the processes in the brain are unconscious. And I will illustrate this with this slide from Mark Solm's presentation. And the theory is quite old. It's Squire's model from 1992, which suggests dividing long-term memory into a declarative, otherwise called explicit, and non-declarative or implicit memory kinds. But what you see here at the very top, this cloud called short-term memory, is a space where we think and where we manipulate mental objects to, let's say, perform calculations. If I were to ask you to multiply 17 times 69 in your head without a pen and paper, then you'll be using this space. Another term for that is working memory. And I'm oversimplifying quite a bit to make a point. But if you need a metaphor from computer science, then that would be RAM, random access memory. This is a more expensive resource, a faster and more flexible memory system, such as a RAM chip. Now, when things are important from what we experience and think, we tend to write them down, or in computer terms, we may encode them in a long-term memory storage, which is in computer science a hard drive, and in neuroscience we'll call it long-term memory. There are two branches of long-term memory, declarative and non-declarative. By definition, when we say declarative, we mean that this is something we can bring to mind, we can think about. An example would be an episode of your life that you can recall, or it could be something you've learned at school, that water is H2O. The first example was episodic memory, and the second was semantic memory. Non-declarative memory, by definition, means that you cannot think about it, and we have a lot of memories like that. A classical example would be a motor memory. For example, if I were to get up from this chair, the sequence of contractions and expansions of the quad muscle on my right leg is a memory. I did not know how to do it when I was 2 months of age, and then I've learned to get up and hold my weight, and I've laid down a memory. But I cannot possibly think about that. This is an unconscious memory, and we call it procedural memory, which is skills and habits. And this is only an example of a motor procedural memory, but a lot of different memories can be procedural, including emotional habits and social habits may become procedural. And then they cannot be brought into mind. We are doing it, but we're not aware of why and how. It's just a raw habit. And this is a filling in of an explanatory gap. You also see here the 3 lines that Mark Solms added of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, and these are terms from Freud. And Mark suggests that we could consider short-term memory to be a conscious process, something we're thinking about right now. Something that we're not thinking about right now, but can possibly bring to mind would be preconscious. And something that we cannot bring to mind in principle is called unconscious. So this explanation of unconscious process / procedural memories, is that Platonic space? I am not sure. Not necessarily, at least, because we have a neuropsychological model of why things remain unexplained to our conscious mind. And while it is still a model, procedural memories, it is well empirically supported. They are not universal. Each person lays down their own procedural memories, and they are individual. They're not timeless or scale invariant like pure mathematical objects. And we'll talk about that later. And they are embodied, they are created and encoded in an individual body. They're not pulled from some outer space via an interface. At least I think that they're. Um, so when we work with a patient in psychotherapy, there's many different things that happen, and there are years and years of training that go into it. But one of the things that happen is we look for patterns, interpersonal patterns, emotional patterns, cognitive, behavioral, etc. What do we mean by pattern in therapy? We are looking for something that repeats in various contexts and repeats in time. We also care in therapy whether this pattern makes sense in the context of the patient's history or not, and whether the patient himself or herself recognizes this pattern. Here are a few examples. It is quite frequent that a child of parents who are separating or divorcing experiences guilt. And let's imagine this is a very young child, a 5-year-old boy. This is not a logical thing. And it may, in and of itself, present an explanatory gap, but just clinically, we see that quite a bit. One of the possible hypotheses about why this is so is that for a child, the idea of separation is just catastrophic. This is the worst thing in the world. The parents' attention and the cohesion of the family is the main currency. And children would prefer anything and everything to the idea that parents want to separate and want to be apart, and then he would have less connection to either one or both. And so then the child gravitates toward a fictional story, if you wish. It's my fault that they are separated. I did this, right? So they come up with an agential explanation. It is, I did so, it's my fault. And another flavor of that is that guilt is an active feeling, which is clear. I mean, I've done something wrong and I should be punished for it, and then I can atone for my sins and get out of jail free. While helplessness is a passive feeling, and helplessness is the worst. It's pretty hard to tolerate helplessness, and it's a frequent symptom of trauma. This is one pattern, perhaps a guilty child. And what you may find out, and I just told you a story of how it possibly came about, but what you'll see in therapy with an adult without that story at all whatsoever is somebody who apologizes all the time and is chronically guilty. And they're prone to explaining things in the world by their own actions, saying, oh, I must have done something here, right? And they're 3 minutes late and they're apologizing, right? Or they interrupt you and they apologize. And it's a pattern, and it happens all the time, everywhere. And perhaps this is in contrast to blaming others. There's this pattern we call externalization, where people see flaws elsewhere, and there's somebody who internalizes, and they gravitate towards seeing themselves as the reason of a problem in the world. Speaking about the second example of externalization, Mark Solms would call this pattern who's who in the zoo. These are individuals who are chronically and in various contexts preoccupied with rank and status. They're unable to have a healthy, on par, reciprocal relationship with another person. They need to dominate or oppress. And in some circumstances where they cannot dominate, they will be kind of obsequious and sort of sycophants. But there's a strict hierarchy, and you're either below or you're above. And so these are the only relationships they see. And all relationships recreate this pattern of oppression. You may see another pattern, which is popularized in a book by Eric Berne, a Canadian psychiatrist, called The Games People Play, and he called it Yes, But. And we call it help projecting complainer. This is a person who starts by presenting helplessness and saying, I'd like to go on vacation, but I don't know where to go. And you try to help them by saying, well, why don't you go to Ocean City? And they will say, well, it's expensive. So they refuse your help. And then you come up with a second alternative. See, why don't you go to Shenandoah National Park? And they will say, yes, but there's no ocean. And it will continue like that. And it drives the person who's trying to help nuts. but this is what's going on as a pattern and perhaps gets replicated. And sometimes when we experience extreme unpredictability, for example, in borderline personality disorder, which could be a euphemism for complex trauma, we may say that interpersonal world of this patient is predictably unpredictable. The only thing we know what's going to happen on Wednesday is that we don't know what's going to happen on Wednesday. And you see, this is perhaps a desperate attempt to apply some kind of rule to something utterly unpredictable. And we look for other patterns. We look for recurrent depressive episodes. If you wish, we're looking for clinical patterns. We see whether anxiety is circumscribed or generalized. We look for recurrent psychotic episodes. We may observe patterns in attentional functioning, such as distractibility, speech patterns, such as rambling, nonverbal patterns, such as tics and tremors. And we look for certain patterns in the patient's history, such as repeated breakups, certain kinds of breakups. So what is a pattern? If we take a very simplistic example, then we can consider that something that is recognized as familiar, and that's a keyword, familiar, and is recognized as being repeated can be a pattern. So repetition is a very key process here. We can only recognize something as familiar when we've encoded it before. And the perceived object has to match what is encoded. There can be mistakes in these calculations, such as déjà vu and jamais vu, where something familiar is being perceived as novel and something novel is perceived as familiar. But, we'll get to that a little bit later. Again, a simplistic example is the recognition of pattern ABC in the string below, and it will happen because it repeats. In neuropsychology, we have ample evidence that recognition is a separate process from free recall, and perhaps there's underlying memory systems that are distinct for recognition. But again, the recognition of familiarity is happening in various functions, in visual functioning, in auditory functioning, in Capgras syndrome, and to cite Meyer and Rust, in visual processing, these are studies with monkeys. They have shown that there's a distinct memory system involved in the processing of recognition. It is not a categorical choice, familiar versus novel. It is probabilistic, and perhaps we coarse grain it as familiar or novel at the top of the hierarchy, but the actual calculations are probabilistic. And this may apply to our recognition of the environment we're in as the same or unexpectedly novel, which happens in a dissociative episode. And it may apply to us recognizing us, including our body, as suddenly very novel, which may happen in a depersonalization or this sort of doubt as, am I me? And not an existential doubt, but visceral, sudden doubt that am I me? If we look at developmental aspect of this process, then if we imagine a human child who is born and lives their life, a newborn child doesn't have any idea what an apple is, none whatsoever. There are some inborn memories, but apple is just nothing. And perhaps I'm sharing an opinion, but this is the kind of school that I was brought up in, and this is the model that I believe in. What happens through the development is child lays down sensory memories. And here, this example, you see perhaps a first experience of a cannery. And that's a visual example, but you can apply to auditory, such as seeing the bird song. And then there's an example of a cardinal. And then you may have an example of a crow, an example of an eagle. And the repeated examples like that result at some point in a child unconsciously, without any intention to do so, creating a category, a coarse graining, visual category, birds. I'm not talking about a verbal label bird. I'm talking about the visual coarse graining, which allows the child to recognize a bird as a class of objects. And this is, if you wish, a level of abstraction. And that happens around 3 or 4 months of age in healthy children. And later on, as language develops, we can see that the verbal differentiation of birds may start around 6 to 9 months of age, and there's a big spurt of development from 13 to 15 months. And you can see that there's progressively increasing level of abstraction from a concrete experience right now, this particular canary, to a coarse-grained generalized experience of visual category bird, and then to a verbal label birds, which becomes associated with the visual category. And then there's an auditory category of a bird song. And perhaps the association cortex visual occipital parietal temporal junction is involved in this process. And I am summarizing very complex literature, but I'm saying that this happens in human development. It can also go wrong, and in this famous book that I believe Michael likes and quotes, Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, this specific case in a book when the man mistook his wife for a cat, he had a visual agnosia. And Oliver Sacks, which was doing house visits at a time, on the way to see the patient, stopped by a flower shop and bought a rose for the lapel of his jacket. And this is how he rolled. And when he appeared and he was examining the patient and he presented this rose to the patient and asked him, "What is it?" And the patient would say, "Oh, I don't know, this is something green with spikes. And what's here at the top? And there's something red. And what is it? I don't know." And then Oliver said, "Smell it." And the patient smelled it, which is changing the sensory modality. And then he said, "It's a rose." So recognition through the olfactory modality was intact, but recognition through the visual modality was not. And then we have language, which is perhaps one of the most abstract things we have in neuropsychological functioning. And I'd like to say that a lot of things that we have in our lives are also perhaps languages. Like mathematics is a certain language, and neurobiology is a language, and music is a language. It has language-like qualities. One of these qualities is that language, human language, unlike the chimp language, allows us to create counterfactuals. And this is perhaps an opinion of Yuval Harari, as a historian. He suggests that in the chimp language, things are very concrete, such as banana or eagle or lion. The chimps are unable to say, "I saw 7 zebras at the waterfall yesterday," because yesterday is an abstraction. It doesn't exist in a concrete world. And our language allows us to create these concepts in addition to percepts. And we talk about things that don't exist in the here and now. And we have a whole lot of them. Limited liability corporation, United States of America, and mathematical objects such as a perfect line, a perfect triangle. We have a lot of things that we invented as concepts that don't exist in the physical world. And if we look at science, then in each branch of science, in each discipline, we can consider that scientists are building progressively higher levels of abstraction that rely on the lower levels. And for example, if you'd like to fully and fluently understand quantum mechanics, which Richard Feynman might say is impossible, but if you're trying well enough, then you at least need to understand complex numbers and probability theory. These are the underlying abstract things that you need to master before you get to the level of entanglement and things like that. And if you take something very complex, such as Georgi Perelman's proof of the Poincare conjecture, then not many people in the world can understand his proof, perhaps maybe 20 people or less, and they may be professors of topology. So we're talking about, let's say, abstract level 100 for Perelman, and people who understand him are at the abstraction level 98. And I'll quote here Edward Frenkel, who is a professor of mathematics in Berkeley. When he talks about Euclidean geometry, it is very important that the objects used in Euclidean geometry are perfect. For example, a perfect period, a perfect dot, has no width. It is infinitely small. And perfect line is infinitely thin, and it is perfectly straight. In an actual physical world, we don't have any objects like that. Any line will have bumps and it will have some thickness. But this is extremely important. The moment you substitute a perfect line of infinitely small thickness and perfect straightness with the physical line, the Euclidean geometry will fall apart. You will not, these things that are derived in the system will not hold. And when we create this perfect idealized object, such as a perfect plane, perfect period, perfect line, they become stable in time. If we look at the Euclidean geometry, which is geometry on the plane now, more than 2,000 years after he came up with it, then the Pythagorean theorem would hold, and it would still be the same as a mental object. So these things, they do not exist in the physical world, and perhaps this is a very high level of abstraction or coarse grain in mathematics, which is why some theorists suggest that when you coarse grain things from different sciences, let's say biology may be seen as based on physics, which may be seen as based on chemistry, etc. But at some point, you will run into mathematics, which is maybe arguably the highest level of abstraction we have in science. A related concept to pattern, if we borrow from the dynamical systems theory, which is a branch of mathematics, and I believe Michael is using this language, is the language of attractors and repellers. I'd like to clarify that attractor is an unfortunate word which creates an impression that it attracts something. Well, this is a descriptive level. This has no causal bearing. This is not a gravitational force that pulls things into an attractor. It purely describes the probability distribution where there's a higher probability of a system to be in a certain region of state space. And this higher probability region would be called an attractor, and a region that is highly improbable, unstable, would be called a repeller. But what I've showed you as single set point attractors is way too simple. If we look at systems as complex as the brain mind, what we probably have is a landscape of attractors and repellers, and that landscape is not static in time. It moves like a river. And this, I think, is the right level of modeling the brain mind as opposed to buckets that you may find in the DSM and ICD, such as a major depressive disorder, which is a stable bucket for life, if you wish, or a bipolar disorder. I think that the more adequate way to look at it would be to draw an attractor and repeller landscape in state space and examine its dynamics, because the system we're dealing with is nonlinear. Then we may have hierarchies of patterns, or patterns of patterns, if you wish. The dynamics of states, and each state is a pattern, can be observed at scales slower than each of the states. And different dynamics of the states can be seen as different patterns. An example would be healthy sleep. Everyone throughout the night will go predictably through about 7 periods, and during each of those periods, there will be different phases of sleep. Each of those sleep phases, such as deep sleep, is a pattern, and the repetition of them in a certain sequence will also be a pattern, which Carl Friston may be calling itinerancy. And we may have interesting things happening each night, such as a phase transition from a rather periodic system in deep sleep, where the wave of an EEG is more or less organized, to a more chaotic functioning in REM. If you look at the wave pattern on a scalp EEG of REM, you will see a chaotic pattern. And the movement of the shift of a system from a periodic functioning, orderly functioning, to a chaotic functioning is a phase transition. And you will see phase transition as a pattern. So again, we can talk about sort of patterning of higher order. I'd like to give you an example of some of this. This is a paper that recently was published and co-authored by Michael Levin, Chris Fields, Lancelot da Costa, Rachel Murphy, Daniel Friedman, David Pincus, and myself. And it examines just one aspect of dissociative experiences. We don't claim to have a universal theory of dissociations, but we are focusing on one aspect of it called the temporal depth. And if you'd like, you can look at that paper and the video presentations that are recorded at the Theoretical Neurobiology seminar. But I'll give you just a small part of it. In the paper, we talk about different components of the mental self. And one of these components is perhaps an autobiographical self, which is our life history, and that we perceive as continuous and coherent. And I am the same Alexey as I have been yesterday, and I predict to be the same Alexey tomorrow. There's certain continuity of my life narrative with the same mental object that we call I. And mathematically, again, we can see that as a set point attractor with an attractor basin is the region in state space surrounding the attractor. And that perhaps is a picture of a coherent autobiographical self that is not fragmented. And that may be a stable functioning throughout the life. I should say that this happens in some regimes of functioning, such as wakefulness. And when you're waking up from sleep to wakefulness, then you may not have that regime. You may have thoughts and tunes and images flow through your head, and you don't actually have a coherent I. And you can, hear Metzinger's thoughts on that, but sort of stateless or selfless, or non-egoic state of mind. But in our wakefulness, phenomenologically, I feel like the same person. And in some clinical circumstances, such as acute trauma or complex trauma, this stable regime may change. Complex trauma would be very sad circumstances of repeated abuse and perhaps neglect, where typically a child has no way to escape and they're stuck in this, repeated abuse and neglect. And that may result, in some circumstances, in the onset of dissociative disorder. And then the transition from the stable landscape to something else will be a temporarily chaotic regime, a phase transition. And it may land here, and this is a hypothesis that perhaps represents an attractor landscape of a certain dissociative disorder, maybe DID, dissociative identity disorder. And what you see here is multiple minima representing H alter. Let's say that there's an alter Jane and an alter Pete and an alter John, and you see those as these three different minima. And the person may shift from one of these states to another state. And I'm quoting here a traumatologist and one of the leading theorists in dissociations, Frank Putnam, where, not unlike the transition between states that represent the phases of sleep, this is a slower time scale, but you may see transitions between these so-called alters in daily functioning of a patient with this condition. And this attractor landscape may become stable. When we talk about a disorder or we talk about this psychopathology taking root, then it is not one occurrence. This becomes a pattern, that this itinerancy between the alters happens. And if we imagine therapy and attempts to help this patient, clinically it would be naive to expect a full recovery and coherence to a full, integrated self. I'm citing Frank Putnam here, but perhaps we can hope for more harmony between the alters and maybe some integration. Perhaps there's less alters. And then when we introduce change in psychotherapy or other therapeutic modalities, then we shift from this stable landscape to, again, temporarily unstable landscape when the system evolves from this to something else. And then it may land to another stable landscape that is perhaps healthier than or less disruptive of functioning than the one that you have just seen. And psychotherapy or other therapeutic measures may be necessary to do that. Now, the difference here is that the transition from health to a disorder happened involuntarily, and sometimes abruptly, and sometimes not abruptly, but the patient didn't want to do it. Therapy happens with a volition when the patient is approaching a licensed mental health professional, and they want to have certain improvement in functioning, and they want to have some relief from the mental pain. I'd like to, with gratitude, show this paper by Leo P. Lopez and Franz Kuchling, Angela Tong, Giovanni Pizzolo, and Michael Levin, Active Inference Morphogenesis and Computational Psychiatry. I believe we have a work in progress trying to look for patterns that can be observed in both biology and psychiatric conditions to follow on this foundation that you can see in this paper. And finally, I'd like to come back to the themes posed by Michael in this symposium. So what are the forms in Platonic space? Hypothesis number one, which perhaps you can feel is present in this talk, that they are concepts that humans came up with and invented. They are abstractions invented by humans and consolidated into cultural memes. Meme is a Richard Dawkins term, and that suggests that when you take a concept and then you repeat it many, many times and throughout a vast physical space, then it becomes a very stable cultural thing, very stable cultural construct. And this account is historical and contextual, which suggests that humans collectively created these forms and made them stable in our culture/language. Hypothesis number 2 is that forms are universal objects that reside in the Platonic space, and we could get access to that space via a certain interface or thin client. And this is an ahistorical account. Where, as Michael puts it, that when we see that xenobots doing kinematic self-replication, we don't know in evolutionary history where that would come from. And the hypothesis here is that this pattern of behavior was pulled from the Platonic space. Now, I would like to comment that the question posed of where did X come from, where did this pattern come from, is a tricky question that I wonder if it leads us to the hypothesis that can be falsifiable and can be tested. Just to observe how this question is formed, I think that the formulation of this question implies historicity, or chicken came from an egg is a historical account. It also suggests prospective causality, where something in the past has caused something in the present. This form of a question seems decontextualized because we can imagine circumstances where pattern A came from B given C and from X given Y, or patterns A probability function was determined by the solution to the Fokker-Planck equation. I don't know if that would be a satisfactory answer to where did pattern come from. The question may be recursive and will never end, because if a pattern came from a Platonic space, we could wonder where did Platonic space come from, etc., etc. In terms of physics, I think that's my impression, and I can be wrong, that this phrasing puts us squarely in the domain of classical physics, not quantum physics. And here I'm quoting Chris Fields, who suggests that the concepts such as stability, scale, observer, and pattern A that came from B are all classical constructs, not quantum constructs. And finally, I think that this question may not be falsifiable and therefore testable in that form. To say a little bit more about that, I think it may not be even answerable. If we consider, this is a Mark Solms example, a sunset, then sunset doesn't exist without an observer. It's a perspectival phenomenon, which is context. If we consider circular causality where A is causing B, which causes A, how does one answer where A came from? And if we take electrons A and B's that are entangled, and the spin of B is known with 100% probability once we know the spin of A, is it possible in this circumstance to answer where the spin of B came from? And would we accept the answer that the wave function of the universe is responsible for the pattern A? That pattern A came from the wave function of the universe. In terms of cultural influences, and this is perhaps an opinion, I think that when we deal with this mystery and awe, there tend to be two kinds of explanations historically. One kind of explanation, and I'm inferring here, I don't know for sure, but we could provisionally call it a divine approach, that these patterns or archetypes came from the collective unconscious or Platonic space or from God. And another approach would be that it's human-made, that humans invented these things. Interesting thing is that both camps may accuse each other of being immodest. For example, the divine proponents of divine approach may say that it is prideful to suggest that humans created something. It is all God made. And but humans, especially with psychologists, some psychologists may say that God has three qualities: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, which is rather grandiose. And so when somebody authors a concept that has these grandiose qualities, then it may suggest that certain pride was involved in creating a concept like that. But it could also be that both of these stories are examples of narrative fallacy. And perhaps a more fruitful avenue of investigation would be to reformulate the question as opposed to asking, where did this pattern come from? And I'd like to thank Michael Levin, Mark Solms, Chris Fields, Carl Friston, Lancelot da Costa, Daniel Friedman, David Pincus, Ruth Lanius, Frank Putnam, Roxy Wolf, Leo Pio Lopez, and many other colleagues that tolerate me and collaborate with me, which I enjoy tremendously, and I'm most grateful for your help. Thank you.